So I'm sure many of you remember this guy from last week's video on Parkfield Community School.
I'm saying to you now that your children will not be safe so long as that Moffat is in this school.
Now, as noted last time, I had no idea who this was, but I do now thanks to viewer Dozy Rosie. As it turns out,
I'm Stephen Green, I'm National Director of Christian Voice.
So yeah, I thought upon discovering this and some of Mr. Green's other materials on YouTube, we'd do a response. So the video you just saw was a short clip from the 2015 video hosted on Christian Voice UK, titled Pardons for Homosexuals. So let's get down to it.
In January 2015, Benedict Cumberbatch and Stephen Fry, who are actors, sent a letter to the government asking them to pardon 49,000 homosexual men convicted of gross indecency under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885, which has since been repealed.
Before going forward, I should likely clarify what the term gross indecency encompasses. Gross indecency was a legal term used to encompass any sexual act between two men outside of penetration. Penetration was classed separately as sodomy at the time, so two men could have sexual acts in their own home. Yet, if say a nosy landlord or lady discovered them, they could be arrested and charged as a result, at which point they'd be faced with a choice: imprisonment or chemical castration. World-renowned writer Oscar Wilde was charged for gross indecency in 1895 and opted for prison. It was there in his final year that he wrote De Profundis. He died shortly after his release from meningitis. Meanwhile, codebreaker and national hero Alan Turing was prosecuted under the same law in 1954, though he opted for chemical castration. Turing was found dead 2 years later, having committed suicide over his treatment. And as noted by Mr. Green, these are but two of 49,000 individuals charged under this frankly disgraceful law for nothing more than physical interaction between two consenting adults. There was never any justification for said law, it was simply based on Victorian moral sensitivities, though of course it has its roots in the Christianization of Rome and the Theodosian code written in the 4th century Common Era. It's one of the earliest social ills inflicted upon society by the religion known as Christianity. Anyway, do continue.
Also last month, of course, Stephen Fry launched into a theologically ignorant tirade against God, asking how the Almighty could dare to create every evil and every disease under the sun. I suppose Almighty God also created the iceberg that sank the Titanic, and you can't get much more evil than that. Or can you? Stephen Fry, of course, is a practicing homosexual, and his entourage now includes the new wifey, little Elliot Spencer.
Mr. Green is of course on about Stephen Fry's RTE1 appearance in 2015. In said interview, he was asked about what he'd do if he were to die and find himself before the gates of heaven, to which he responded rather plainly,
I'd say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in
on
that?
No, but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable.
Now, he also talked about passing away and facing other deities, but I played the content most relevant to Christianity and its proposed God. The question is, how is Fry's response theologically ignorant? He actually goes to great lengths to tailor his main response to Christianity and what the Bible says. The Christian God created a deliberately flawed system according to the Bible, setting up a world in which human beings had no knowledge of right and wrong, only to punish them for acting out of said designed ignorance. That's why, according to the Christian doctrine, Adam and Eve did not realize the immodesty of their nudity until the fruit was consumed. If you don't explain why something is wrong to someone and they just go ahead and do it anyway, how is that their fault? Most reasonable people would argue it isn't. This is something I witness routinely here in India. Yes, I do my best to know what I should and should not do, but my partner reassures me that if I were to make a social mistake, people understand that there's a cultural difference and by proxy, a level of ignorance. So it would appear that human beings are far more advanced than your God in that regard. As for the weird crack about the iceberg that sank the Titanic, what was that meant to achieve? I've seen some of the commenters in support of Green praise his tongue-in-cheek approach, but I just don't see it. Tongue-in-cheek requires some degree of intelligence to actually make it work. This is just saying random shit as if it amounts to an argument. Also, Elliot Spencer is his husband. I may not be a big fan of Stephen Fry, but that doesn't stop me from calling you out for being a misgendering piece of shit.
Mr. Cumberbatch recently played the homosexual codebreaker Alan Turing in a film. Turing was convicted of gross indecency in 1952 and was pardoned by Her Majesty in 2013. Despite not being that way inclined himself, Mr. Cumberbatch is old-fashioned enough to want to marry his Sophie Hunter before their baby arrives. He has a lot of homosexual friends in the circles in which he moves, and he's getting a bit of a reputation for pro-gay campaigning. Indeed, his latest mission is to replace Charles Darwin with Alan Turing on a £10 note. Although, to be frank, anyone will be better than the man who put the Duracell battery in Richard Dawkins. But back to this call to Her Majesty's government to pardon all men like Turing who've been convicted of gross indecency or what they call other discriminatory anti-gay legislation. Well, I want to support this campaign because this generation of Benedict Cumberbatch and Stephen Fry must be the most sophisticated, intelligent, compassionate and plain clever generation that's ever walked this earth. So it follows that any legislation that has been passed by previous generations must be completely stupid because they were stupid, weren't they?
Again, to be tongue-in-cheek, there has to be some basis or purpose to what you say. This jab is dependent on this being the argument on offer for the decriminalization and pardoning for those prosecuted for being gay or bisexual, but it's not. So this just comes off as a desperate attempt at a straw man. Now, I was going to go on to discuss the fact that the government has no place telling two consenting adults that they cannot have sexual relations, but then I realized that this would be pointless. You see, Mr. Green here is pro-rapist, and I don't mean that in the sense of he happens to be friends with a known rapist and still defends them. I mean he actively campaigns to legalize rape, and it's all part of the Christian Voice UK's mission. In an article titled Britain in Sin, Christian Voice UK goes on to note various changes to the law in relation to such things as divorce, abortion, and LGBT+ people. And one of those changes is the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, the year I was born. Now here's the paragraph found just underneath said heading. Quote, "This act reduced the minimum age for homosexual activity to 18, redefined enforced sodomy as rape in order to equate buggery with sexual intercourse, and legalized buggery on women. It also introduced an offense of marital rape, drafted by the Law Commission, unknown in the law of God, and in conflict with the marriage service of the Book of Common Prayer, where the promises given by a man and woman to each other establish a binding consent to sexual intercourse. The right to petition the court for the restoration of conjugal rights was abolished by the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act of 1970 at the instigation of the Law Commission. Law Commission Report 23, 1969, end quote. So I'm not exactly sure that an argument about consent is going to matter a whole lot to the leader of an organization of, 600 plus Christians who believe that consent is something a person forfeits at marriage. But I do think Mr. Green and the members of Christian Voice UK need to be placed under police observation as there is a very real danger present.
It follows that if something is not against the law now, well, it never should have been. So all the men convicted of doing indecent, unsanitary, unhealthy, abusive and downright dangerous things with other men should obviously be pardoned.
No. Abuse is still abuse and is still criminal. Thankfully, we're not run by a group of zealots like yourself who would love to strip away said safety nets for the actual victims of abuse. Also, all sex carries with it some degree of danger. and given proper sex and relationship education, that danger is minimized. That's for both same-gender and opposite-gender relations. The worst thing you can do is impose Christian abstinence-only education. Places that do so in America have the highest STIs, highest levels of teen pregnancies, highest levels of abortion, of risk behavior related to sex, and people start sexual activity at a younger age on average. So if you genuinely want to get rid of that shit, keep Christianity out of politics and most certainly out of schools. Also, the argument you are making here could easily be applied to any number of social ills we've moved beyond. Take chattel slavery, for example, something completely supported by the Bible, both Old and New Testament. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5-8 read as quote, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them, not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free." End quote. And we only have to turn to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44-46 to see what is meant by slavery. Said verses read as quote, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clan born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." End quote. Now, nobody is arguing that just because a law is from a previous generation, that said law must be bad. But we should constantly be reviewing our legal system and challenging the principles used to reach a conclusion on what should and should not be legal. The slavery example is a very good case of why that's important, regardless of your barbaric scripture and what it says. And I'd argue that it's as wrong on LGBT+ folk as it is slavery.
Now, a lot of homosexual activity takes place with strangers in public toilets or in open spaces like this picnic area. Gay shows the way, what?
What the fuck is this? The 60s? Green is very clearly referencing the tea rooming, or as it was known in the UK, cottaging, the phenomenon researched by American sociologist Lord Humphreys in his 1968 PhD dissertation titled Tea Room Trade, a study of homosexual encounters in public places. He then went on to publish his work in the form of a book. His work is used today as an example of participant observation research. No, he did not partake in sexual acts. He took on the role of watch queen, a person given the job of looking out for approaching police. The research was carried out at a time where homosexuality was criminalized. Now, typically a person would be with their parents or renting from a landlord or lady until they got married and settled down. And in each of those instances, there was a high risk of being caught in the act. So it was safer to meet up in public places such as bathrooms. This of course made it near impossible to form long-term relationships, which, when added on top of poor sex and relationship education, increases the risk factor exponentially. But those issues are socially caused by the criminalization and social hostility, the sort Green supports, which is why since the legalization of homosexuality for over 21-year-olds in the UK in 1967 and in the US across all states in 2003, things have improved steadily. Note, improved, not resolved. And tea rooming is not really a thing anymore. Sure, some people have sex in public, but it's not part of queer culture. It's something that young people of all sexualities do. Now, maybe you're not aware of that fact, but as a recent student, I can vouch for the fact that heterosexual people do it all the time. But no, most homosexual activity, as you put it, does not take place in public spaces. It takes place in the privacy of one's own home. As for how well people know each other, that depends on the person and what they want. Much like heterosexual people, gay and bisexual people are capable of one-night stands or monogamous relationships. Though I'd like to note, 54% of the people in Lord Humphrey's study outwardly presented as heterosexual. many of them had married wives out of compulsion, making the adultery a tragic result of latent homophobia. Now, many of them went even further than simply presenting as heterosexual. They took on the breastplate of righteousness, a phrase used by Humphreys to describe a queer person's adoption of socially and politically conservative viewpoints to distract from what they've been doing in all this time. I'm looking at you, Green.
You know, on reflection, perhaps a pardon is not enough. If Stephen Fry and Mr. Cumberbatch had had their wits about them, they could have been demanding for those men convicted British Empire medals for services to cottaging and cruising. But why stop with homosexual men? Yes, they are a fashionable cause, but what about pornographers and abortionists? What they do and did was legalised in the 1960s, so anyone convicted before those laws were changed clearly needs a pardon. Looking to the future, if a government were ever to legalise cannabis, there could be no end of people up for pardon. And rightly so, Benedict, eh? Uncomfortably, Daniel the prophet said the Antichrist would speak great words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High and think to change times and laws. But then, Daniel the prophet lived more than 50 years ago, at least. So we can cheerfully disregard what he had to say, can't we? Can't we?
And that is thankfully the end of the torture, which is Mr. Green and his presentation. And I have to say, he is about as charismatic as a shit-covered lamprey. The amount of straw being shoveled here in attempts to paint the opposition as ridiculous completely backfires. As noted earlier, it just comes off as desperate. Nobody is arguing for medals, merely the decency to admit that as a nation, we thoroughly fucked up and a lot of people suffered as a result. They were victims of a failed system. They deserve both a pardon and an apology. And if they're alive, they deserve compensation as well. And the same is true for other things which have been or may possibly be decriminalized. This is one of the issues being raised in America in states where weed has been legalized. Primarily white upper middle to upper class people are raking in a new industrial scale cash flow. Meanwhile, working class black people rot in prison for the exact same act, but on a much smaller scale. Now, if you have an issue with that, then please argue against the law decriminalizing something. That's very much in your right. But your slippery slope fallacy doesn't sell your position very well. Certainly not when coupled with the straw man you've been presenting so far. So what do you guys think? Is expecting pardons and apologies for the victims of an unjust legal system fair? Or does it set a dangerous precedent? Be sure to comment down below. I'll link some other videos you might want to check out at the end of the video, and please don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. We are trying to make the channel ad-free, so be sure to check that out. And speaking of Patreon, I'd just like to give a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R., John Schoenrock, Alexander Williams, Rain Kilmore, and Daniel Martinez. Take care now, and I'll see you next time.